Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first ever Synapse podcast. I am the host, Paul Benson. I'm the co-founder of Synapse. We are a performance marketing firm specializing in paid search, SEO, social media, and analytics. And I am joined here by Matt Kaminski. Matt is the leader of Full Sprint, master of all things Google ecosystem focused, particularly Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, and Google Data Studio. Matt, welcome aboard. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, no, psyched to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. So the focus for today is going to be GA4, Google Analytics 4. Before we dive in, for those that are watching, I just wanted to mention that this is our first podcast, but we're going to be putting out monthly podcasts moving forward on digital marketing, more advanced digital marketing concepts. We're going to have continued expert guest speakers like Matt talking about specific topics in their arena. So if you're watching this video, please subscribe on YouTube and like it. We really appreciate it. So without further ado, let's jump into today's topic, which again is Google Analytics 4. Matt, there's a lot of talk about GA4, which is what we'll probably refer to it as we go through. Because of the timing around it, and anytime there's big changes to a pretty ubiquitous platform, there's going to be a lot of chatter. So some of the things we're going to talk about is how GA4 is different from GA3 or Universal Analytics, why Google is introducing a new platform, why we would recommend implementing it now, sooner the better, and some of the major pain points and just thoughts around that in terms of workarounds, et cetera. So Matt, let's dive in. I'm going to hand this off to you. I'm going to ask you just some questions. We're going to shoot through it. But I know that you've been implementing a lot of GA4 recently for some of your direct clients as well as some of our Synapse shared clients. So I guess to start off, if you could just walk us through like what is GA4, how it's different from GA3, and then we'll get into a little bit like why Google decided to go this route.
Yeah, sure. Right. So Google Analytics 4 is the next generation platform for offered by Google to track both website and app interactions. And so it's the reason it's kind of caused such so much chatter in the marketplace is because what it's replacing, Universal Analytics, has been around for almost 10 years now. So like you said, it's ubiquitous. A lot of people have built careers on it. They know it in and out. And so anytime there's such a big change like this, there's going to be a lot of discomfort, concern, worry, a little bit of excitement, hopefully. So what they're doing, this is really a completely different platform, GA4 versus Universal Analytics. It's all event-driven, meaning there's not as much a concept of like a page view versus a session, and page views versus events and that sort of thing. Everything is an event, which kind of helps more with merging app and web data if you need to. So it takes a little bit more thought from an implementation perspective. And we're going to get into that later into the podcast, but it is a big change. And hopefully today we can help walk you through some of those changes and what to look out for and make sure you're comfortable with the transition.
Yeah, and like a couple of years ago, Google redid the Google Ads interface, and I remember at the time, everybody was like, "Oh no, it's new interface, it's awful," right? But change is usually awful until you get used to it. And I think this is as you mentioned, it's a re-platform, it's a reskinning of the user interface, not just how the back end works. So
yeah, it's everything.
It's the whole kit and caboodle. So folks will have to get familiar with it from the marketing side and obviously from the more technical side. But I think that makes sense. So I guess just from like a timeline perspective, I know there's a couple different pieces to that, right? Like when businesses should actually implement GA4 and then when they should start using GA4 and some of the steps in between. So can you just talk like a little bit about the timeline for implementation and then actually using GA4 on a regular basis?
Yeah, sure. So I think probably one of the biggest surprises, again, in the market, other practitioners that are in this space, I think the biggest surprise was that Google put a sunset date on Universal Analytics, which I think maybe some folks thought it was coming or thought it was possible, but I think the speed at which they put a date, kind of an end date on universal analytics surprised a lot of folks. And so that's why there's kind of this more sense of urgency to transition, obviously. So just to give a little bit of a timeline. So GA4 was out, has been out for a little while now. I think it officially launched in the fall of 2020. Even before that, in 2019, it was known as app and web as a beta product. But it wasn't until this year, March of 2022, that they announced the sunsetting of Universal Analytics. So that's coming a year from now, July of 2023. So they're saying on July 1 of 2023, their Universal Analytics is going to stop processing new data collection. And then at that point, you have about 6 months to still have access to your Universal Analytics properties and do what you can to extract the data and historical reports out of that platform for kind of archival purposes, and obviously so you can continue to have that data right about your business. So that brings you to roughly the end of 2023 is kind of the hard cutoff there. There's a few nuances for if you're a 360 customer, which means you're paying for Google Analytics, which is probably a small percent of the market, but you do get a slight additional grace period if you're a 360 customer. I believe it's October 1st is your cutoff date for data processing, and then again another 6 months out from there. Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up like the GA360 piece because it works a little bit differently for them. But so sunsetting July 1st of next year basically means that it's no longer going to collect data for your website starting July 1st of next year, which is obviously important date. So why now? Why are we recommending to clients and businesses that they get GA4 up and running now?
Yeah, I mean, a number of reasons. I think one of the first kind of obvious reasons is start data collection on the new platform. The sooner you do that, again, GA4, the sooner you get data flowing, the sooner you'll have data in the platform to report on. And a lot of folks are talking about that will give you year over year reporting capabilities, right? That's while it's not the end all be all, it is very nice to have year over year comparisons for even basic metrics like sessions, page views, conversions, that sort of thing. So that's why there's the urgency kind of today to get GA4 up and running, is so you can get those year over year views. But the other reason, in my opinion, is because it's such a different platform, a little bit different from an implementation perspective, a lot different from a reporting and like data access perspective. So it just helps to get comfortable with it sooner rather than later. So the more that either your kind of analytics experts can get their hands on it, the more kind of your everyday analysts can get into the tool and learn the new UI, the better. Just so it's not quite as steep of a learning curve when you're forced on this next year.
Yeah, well, Matt, we've taken your advice because we, first of all, have recommended to our clients that they transition as soon as possible. And many have, which is great. And we're working actually through a couple more implementations over the next couple of weeks. So I think we're in good shape there. But then the second piece is like knowing what we're doing in there once right. We're actively using it. And so I think the idea is, run them concurrently, right? Let the GA4 platform collect data, but keep GA3 running and have that really be your primary analytics platform as it has been historically, and then build up some expertise and familiarity with the GA4 platform, because again, it is a completely new user interface. So on our side, our timeline for Synapse has been get clients transitioned over as quickly as possible, and then use Q3 and Q4 of this year to get acclimated and familiar with the platform so that we can really start to fully utilize it starting early next year. So by the time July comes along, we're not hustling or rush to right. start that transition. Because again, a lot of our client reporting is built off of analytics data. So that includes our Google Data Studio reports and some of our other automated reports. Yeah. So if we can get those set up well before July, then as July comes, it can be a lot, much smoother transition. So
Yeah, you bring up a really good point with the dual implementation. So we should just make it clear that, yeah, you do not have to rip out your universal analytics code when you deploy GA4. We would not recommend that. We would keep them, you can keep them both running on your site in parallel. So both continue to, collect data basically until you're told that you can't on anymore with universal analytics.
Yep.
Again, yeah, you'll have many folks in your organization that will still continue to rely on universal analytics as long as they can. Again, there's some feature gaps that we'll talk about that you might be able to only get from universal analytics. So definitely keep them both up and running for the time being.
Yep. For sure. And just to kind of, I guess, recap the timeline, because it's pretty important. So I think now is the time to create the GA4 property if you haven't already. Yeah. It's going to be sunsetted. GA3 is going to be sunsetted July 1st of next year, 2023. So you're not going to be able to collect any new data starting July 1st, 2023. And then in terms of losing access to that data altogether, as Matt mentioned earlier, I think they're estimating roughly 6 months. I think from the Resource Center and Google, they are saying at least 6 months, I believe, yeah. But that timeline is sort of up in the air. So, but at some point, I think it's important, probably important to reiterate that we're going to lose that data altogether at some point, right?
Right. Yes. So, I don't know how much time we'll have to get into it today, but there's a number of different ways, even for free universal analytics users, there's a number of ways to get the data out of the platform. Unfortunately, there's no easy kind of plug and play like download button. You have to be a little bit strategic about it and figure out which are your most important reports and views, dimensions and metrics that you want to get out, and then kind of honestly go about it as if you'd be pulling reports, pulling long-term trended reports to get out what you need, and yep. kind of store them in a, almost a static location, whether could even be a spreadsheet or a yep. flat file or, what have you. So we might be able to get into that a little more later, but yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. So I guess one of the other questions that we have asked ourselves and have gotten asked as well is why a new platform, right? Like why reskin and redesign the UX, and why build sort of new backend? Like why rebuild rather than just iterate on GA3?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't work for Google. I don't represent mm-hmm. Google. So I'm kind of just, these are just my opinions and my thoughts. I think part of it, like any software system that's 10 plus years old, probably has some cobwebs, under the hood. So I think for them, it's likely an opportunity to upgrade and re-platform from a technical perspective onto perhaps newer, whether it's a newer back end, newer front end technologies, that sort of thing. So I think the technical piece is part of it. I will say that the data schema, like how they're storing and collecting data, is very different in GA4. Like I mentioned, that it's a whole event-driven model now. It makes it much friendlier to merge native app data. So, iOS or Android applications, it's this new architecture in GA4 makes it much easier to combine those data sets, the native app data sets with the web data set, because yep. it's a common schema. Yep. I think that was a big driver behind this. Again, kind of on top of some of the technical improvements, their ability to leverage their big data capabilities, AI and machine learning. I think they're putting themselves in a better position to leverage the data that the site owners are creating with their apps, and be able to provide recommendations from propensity to convert modeling, propensity yep. to churn modeling, valuable segments within your data that they're going to be able to recommend. I think all of that is part of it.
Matt, what about privacy? I know like the evolution or shifts in privacy and security concerns yes. has been pretty significant, both domestically and also in Europe, obviously with GDPR. Right. But what are your thoughts? Do you think that's a component as well?
I do. Yeah. So I don't quite know the line between like more proactive? Was it a more proactive move or a more reactive kind of defensive move in light of a lot of the recent litigation that's come against Google Analytics specifically in the last 6 months?
Yeah.
But I think because of the new platform, they're investing all of their new features around privacy. It's going into GA4. So you're going to see a lot more control, whether, caveat, right? We're not lawyers. You should always check with your legal counsel and privacy team and that sort of thing. But they're adding new features in GA4 around data processing, right? So like if you're an EU site operator, Google Analytics 4 will allow you to process that data on EU servers, like locally to your region. Yeah. They're doing things like not storing IP address in the logs by default, because that's been shown in a lot of the recent litigation that it can be considered PII and ultimately linked to a person. So that, so they are all that development and innovation is happening in GA4. Yeah. And they are giving site owners more control. So that's absolutely a component to this.
Yeah. So, I mean, it just sounds like there's a lot of moving pieces, right? Like a lot of what is built into GA4, there's probably different reasons for it, back end changes, front end changes, and how those all interact. So a lot of different reasons for it, but it is here. And I guess on that note, we kind of touched on this earlier a little bit, but biggest differences between GA4 and GA3 so far. And let's start with like just the user experience and just like how data is collected in terms of like views and segments.
Yeah. So sure. So, I mean, biggest differences, like I said, they're very different platforms. I think from a UI and UX perspective, if you're talking about logging into the tools on, tomorrow, you'll just notice it's a much lighter weight UI in GA4. So if you're used to seeing that kind of heavy duty left nav on Universal Analytics, where you have, maybe it's 6 or 7 primary sections, and then sub reports nested underneath, it's going to be probably less than half of that in GA4. You get a lot of the basics, like you'll get, what are my top pages? What are my top tracked events from views, clicks, scrolls, file downloads? Like you'll get a lot of the basics, but there's just lighter from the canned reports. They're just not as numerous.
Yeah, I think and for those that are listening and watching, Matt's referring to, the real-time reporting, the audience acquisition, behavior conversions, all those sort of standard built-in left side report sections in GA3.
Yes. So there are certainly equivalents in GA4, like real-time. Actually, real-time's definitely a bright spot in GA4. It's, first of all, it's more accurate and precise. There's been a lot of known issues with real-time reporting and Universal Analytics being kind of heavily latent and not living up to its name of real-time. So again, all the investment and innovation is happening on the GA4 side. So that particular report is better. There's some live like debugging capabilities in GA4 that are better. Generally speaking, though, the approach, the strategy with GA4 is going to be they're trying to push folks to this Explore tool, which is kind of a free-form report builder, which for, some folks might be familiar with similar apps where you can kind of drag and drop dimensions and metrics, where it's like, I want to look at source and medium by day, show me sessions, show me conversion rate, that sort of thing. That's what they're trying to have you build or take advantage of in GA4. So that's a bit of a shift in how you use the tool.
Matt, is that like a custom reports enhanced or 2.0?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. It's custom reports, but with a little more horsepower, a little more flexibility. They even have added capabilities like a nice funnel builder. So if you're, whether you have an e-commerce site or a lead gen site that has a very defined, step 1, step 2, step 3, either purchase or form completion, you'll be able to spec that out nicely in GA4. So there's definitely some benefits there, but you kind of have to change your thought process on what you want to do when you get into the tool. It's a little more hands-on in that regard.
Got it. I don't know how much we should dive into it, but in terms of, the standard way to sort of segment different things that you want to look at in GA3 is with views. And I know they're sort of getting rid of views as they're getting rid of, as GA3 goes away, so will views.
Yeah.
And they're sort of replacing that, as we know, with custom segments. Anything to note on that? I mean, I think the one pain point we had with views historically was if you need to use multiple views for reporting purposes, you had to recreate any goals and events in each view individually or independently. This won't, in GA4, you won't be required to do that. But anything else to note in terms of like views sort of going away and custom segments sort of taking over for that?
Yeah, so I think that is a bit of a downside. So the companies that are used to having several views for kind of pre-filtering out their GA property to say, hey, maybe here's a blogs only view, or here's a dev or QA view, or here's like a, only my Marketo landing pages. Like, that it's not, you can't do that pre-filtered view. There's no equivalent in GA4. You really just have properties. And so, you would be limited to making, probably segments would be the best, the best thing in GA4, where you could help your stakeholders define those, basically redefine what you had as views, create segments, and then you'd have to create those exploration reports to get the data sets that you need.
Got it. What about, do you have insight into sampling? Like right now, I think generally speaking, there's always exceptions to this. And the standard reporting in GA3, you don't typically encounter sampling, although sometimes you can, depending on if you're adding secondary dimensions, et cetera. But in custom reports, you tend to encounter sampling quite a bit. Do you know if the Explorer reports are they're going to likely be more similarly sampled as custom reports are today, or do we have insight on that yet?
So both platforms are subject to sampling. Also, assuming we're talking about the free accounts, I think 360 will have higher thresholds, and while sampling still occurs on 360 accounts, it's not quite as common. So so if we're talking about the free accounts, both platforms are subject to sampling. I actually think there are some benefits to GA4 on this. From what I've read in their documentation and kind of experienced, the standard reports in GA4 are basically never subject to sampling. So that's what you would get in that left nav. And that's even if you do add secondary dimensions, or do they have a comparison feature where you could look at like the US versus Canada, or CPC versus organic. There should not be sampling on those reports in GA4, whereas in GA3, as soon as you started opening it up to like secondary dimensions and adding segments, that sort of thing, you're more likely to sample. So I think there's some improvements there, but if you are in the explorations report interface, you are subject to sampling. So I think similar limits apply there.
That makes sense. I know we talked like offline about GA360. I think you had mentioned maybe some lower tiered options. I don't know how much you've looked into that. I'm not familiar with that at all, but just in terms of GA360, I know historically, I think it was around, what was it? I think it was like 150 or 250,000 for the annual.
Yeah, I think it was certainly in the six figures. I think it was about 150 starting point. But so Google Analytics is sold almost exclusively through resellers. So I would, encourage folks listening to this to look either, talk to their existing reseller, or, do some research on which sort of partner you'd like to work with to answer these questions specifically. But from what I've learned, the price of entry for GA4 360 is lower. I think in some cases, depending upon your traffic, you can get in for a fraction of of that six figure, of that 150.
Yeah.
And that would open up some things as far as, less likelihood for sampling, more custom dimensions, events and that sort of thing.
Right. That makes sense. That's something we're going to look into too, Matt, and maybe we can circle back and we can even update in the description kind of what we found there. But
Sure.
It's interesting. And I'm wondering if for some of our clients, it'll make sense at a lower price point to invest in SA360. We use it for some clients today, and there's definitely some benefits, including, like you mentioned, like lack of sampling, which is fantastic. That alone is highly valuable because it allows us to do some more of the custom reports without having to run into that. So that definitely can be valuable. So, okay, cool. So I know we touched on this a little bit, but just like the top one or two benefits and drawbacks of GA4. And again, I think we touched on some of this a little bit already, but if you had to say, these are the biggest benefits that we're going to get from GA4 and maybe some of the biggest drawbacks and any workarounds or thoughts on those drawbacks, that would be great.
Sure. So exactly. I mean, I know there is obviously some negative sentiment out there just because, like we said, any change for such a ubiquitous platform is going to come with some stress and some, kind of, what do I do now? But yeah, there are definitely some benefits. One thing that I think might get overlooked quite a bit is that they have improved the implementation in regard to some automatic data collection. So previously with Universal Analytics, if you put the standard JavaScript snippet on your site or deployed the standard page view tag in Tag Manager, page views are really all you'd get. And obviously you'd get your standard traffic metrics like sessions and users and things like that. With GA4, they are trying to relieve you of a little bit more customization where you can get things like scroll tracking, outbound link clicks, meaning when somebody leaves your domain and goes off site, video engagement metrics if you're using a YouTube player, site search, file downloads. So there's probably 5 or 6 additional events that you can basically check a box and have activated like from day one, which is pretty cool. It's again, every business is different, and those may or may not be high value interactions for your business, but that's an improvement. So I would mention that. I mean, the ability for companies where it's applicable, the ability to merge native app and web data is pretty huge, especially if you have a login experience where you can tie a web user with an app user through some sort of authentication or a login moment. That's a very cool and powerful feature. There are, a lot of, over the years with Universal Analytics, folks have kind of moaned and groaned about, I only get 20 goals, for example, or I only get 20 custom dimensions. Yep. There are slightly higher limits in that respect in GA4. So that's nice. If you're finding yourself always up against that that 20, you get a few more. I think it's 25 things, custom events, I believe, or custom dimensions. So there are some improvements there. Yep. The other big one is BigQuery. So this is for companies that might have a slightly more mature, like, maybe a BI team or set of data engineers can take big advantage of this, where even in the free tier of GA4, you're actually eligible to turn on a BigQuery data transfer, which gives you all of your raw data. Like we're talking the, hit by hit, row by row. You can actually pretty much for free, copy that over to BigQuery and then have your data engineers push it into whatever environment, whether it's Snowflake or Redshift or wherever you need to go, or just analyze it in BigQuery. So that's a big draw as well.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we touched on this earlier. And by the way, not to overlook the BigQuery thing, because I think we sort of touched on this, the fact that data is going to be stored Well, first of all, the fact that when we switch over at some point, we're going to lose our data. And then also there's a data retention limit of, I believe, 14 months. We'll talk about that in just a second. But at the end of the day, there's probably going to be an emergence of solutions that allow advertisers and businesses to store their historical GA4 data because A, it is going to go away at some point, and B,
GA3, you mean?
Sorry, GA3, yeah. And because the data, the retention on some of the data in GA4, which I'll let you speak to, will have a 14-month retention window on it. Can you just speak to that 14-month, what data that impacts, and if BigQuery would be a potential solution there as well?
Yes. Yeah. So let me pull up my notes here just to make sure I don't misspeak. So there is in Universal Analytics, you had the choice to have Google retain your data for, I think, up to 50 months. And that has come down significantly with GA4. So it actually defaults to 2 months when you first create your property. So that's kind of a good gotcha or heads up for folks listening that are deploying GA4 for the first time. Like day one, I would go in and at least change it from 2 months to 14 months. But the other thing I would say to that is, while it might sound a little, kind of scary, it's really just kind of the user level, more custom reports that are going to run into issues or kind of blackouts with this 14-month window. If you're, again, similar to the sampling issues, any report that you can see in the standard UI when you log in, those would not be subject to this blackout, this more than 14 months. It really would be things that you would do in explorations, or anytime you're pulling in like more user level data, right, which is especially true if you're pulling in custom attributes like a user ID, for example, or logged in status, stuff like that. So yeah, while it is more limiting than GA3, the standard reports will be available, and then you have BigQuery in a few other ways I could talk about to help get around that.
That definitely makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of, it'd be like speculating a bit, but I would think that maybe some of these changes that we've discussed may have happened in GA3 if GA4 never came out, because some of the reasonings behind it that impact privacy and security, et cetera. Some of the rationale is to better protect those things. So it's possible some of these changes would have been affecting us anyway, even if GA4 weren't being rolled out. So I think it's just
I think that's a valid point. I think also that Google just doesn't want to. I don't know if you mentioned at the top of the podcast, but something like 40 million sites are using Google Analytics for free, and if you're talking five years of data, I mean that's just the amount of data that they're going to have to store. I think they're probably trying to save some costs as well.
Yeah, it could be like hey, we're gonna not save as much, but GA 360 is here. GA4 360 is here, and it's a little lower price point if you want to go that route, right?
Or store it in BigQuery and pay us that way, kind of thing.
Matt, is BigQuery Google specific? Is it a Google product? Okay, it's a Google solution.
Yeah, so it's part of their cloud platform. So it's their big data environment.
Got it.
So that's why.
Okay, that makes sense. So we talked about the data retention piece. I think we talked about some of the biggest benefits. I guess two other things that come up quite a bit. One is we talked about the standard reporting in GA4 and kind of what it looks like today. There's not going to be as many sort of tabs or sort of sections on the left-hand dashboard. What is your guess, gut, instincts, et cetera, tell you about if that is going to change between now and the sunsetting of GA3 in July of next year? Do you think that they'll build out more of that functionality or kind of leave it as is?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's going to look exactly the same as it does today in another 3 to 6 months. They will be adding to it. They already have. Is it going to get to the level of standard reports that there was in UA? I don't think so. But I do think they're going to add to what's there because it is pretty skinny, pretty light right now.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on the as exciting as this sounds, there's like a release notes page for GA4 that if you check out, they are continually adding, like this is where they're investing their product management time, their, feature development, like everything is going into GA4. So over the last, just since this year, there's been, I don't know, it looks like 6 or 7 big releases where they're adding new integrations with like the more premium ad products like DV360, Search Ads 360. Right. There's now a Google Search Console integration.
Yeah.
And then just recently they've added, there's like little pain points that people have been bringing up and reporting. They're starting to tackle them. So keep an eye open. You're going to start seeing more capabilities and probably a few more reports in there.
Got it. Makes sense. Matt, I don't know if you know this, but offhand for GSC, for Search Console, we're almost always using Search Console directly versus GA, although for some of our clients that are on SA360, we've used it with the integration. But do you know if GSC currently integrates with regular GA3 today?
It does, yeah. So and you're allowed to have the same Search Console or domain of it. You're allowed to link it once to a UA property and once to a GA4 property at the same time. We just tested that with one of my clients. So
nice. Okay, cool.
I think capabilities wise, it's very similar in GA4. It's a fairly limited view of the world. I know you'd asked some questions about, do you have any more power with filtering on, like landing page and query? It doesn't look to be any more flexible yet in GA4.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that goes back to, for those that don't have the context, like Matt and I were talking offline about Search Console data, and in Google Search Console directly, you can actually do like filtering for multiple dimensions or variables. Like you can look at specific queries for a specific landing page, whereas when you're looking at the integrated version in GA3 or GA4, it doesn't have quite the same level of functionality. But that's fine, right? You can always log into Search Console.
Yeah, it's really just meant to be a handy, like, hey, so you don't have to switch screens or log out. You could, you can get some basic information.
Yep, for sure. Okay. So, and I guess, like, by the way, just speaking of the standard reports again, I think like, one of two things is going to happen, right? They're either going to roll out additional standard reporting options or features, or we're just going to be diving more deeply into the custom report component of GA4, right? And so we're going to, and that kind of goes back to why we're not transitioning now to using GA4, because we want to do sort of like let's see what's going to happen with the platform. And also, as we talked about earlier, we got to learn it because it is a different interface, but let's see what happens over the next few months. And then let's get ourselves up to speed with what we think is like a more fully baked version of GA4, rather than start now and then it changes and we have to relearn things or change our process. So that's kind of our approach. I don't know if you agree with that, but
yeah, I mean, my only hesitation would be, I would, whether it's kind of like a test drive or almost like what do you call, like a drill. I would, at least for whether it's a week or a month, try to act like it's your primary tool, because that's kind of the only way. Like if you keep saying, I'm not going to use it for primary analytics, then you're going to get to July of next year and be like, how do I use this thing? So I would, maybe you wouldn't send it. You wouldn't rely on it for like, I need to get my boss something like ASAP tomorrow, because you might run into hiccups on, I actually can't get this metric, or I can't. But in kind of like a drill, like, a drill exercise just for your own sake, I would kind of push the limits of saying, how can I build this in GA4? I even have even in my own business, sometimes I'm doing it in parallel, like trying to build it in GA4 as kind of like a thought experiment. If I can do it, I'll deliver it. But if I run into a hiccup, all right, I've got GA3 over here as a backup. But I would probably push our listeners to start living into that of like, can I deliver what I need in GA4?
It makes sense. I mean, so obviously there's a few things you can do when running them concurrently. One is like starting to learn it. The other one is looking at discrepancies between the two, just to make sure, like, as you sort of start migrating over to GA4, that the data lines up. So when you make that transition, you're good with the data. You're not worried about any sort of fluctuations. And if you do see fluctuations, you have time to troubleshoot and figure out why they may be different. Matt, are there any standard, like, popular reasons or common reasons why GA4 and GA3 data might be different, or should users expect the numbers to line up like within 5%?
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of a pain point for analysts. Like, for any two platforms, they're not going to match. Like, so right. I really wouldn't get too hung up. I think probably 5% is being too restrictive. Like, they are completely different systems, different backends. I mean, 5-10% would be awesome. So it all depends on your exact situation, but generally speaking, especially if you're deployed like both GA3 and GA4 through Tag Manager, they should be in the same ballpark. But if you're off 12% on one of the metrics and it's like consistent, day in and day out, and the fluctuations like follow the same lines,
right?
I wouldn't spin your wheels too much.
Right. I think that's fair. Yeah, I think every platform we've ever compared to each other have been off. Maybe the one exception is like Google Ads and analytics data, depending on what type of business it is. Sometimes those line up quite closely, but everything else we look at, especially any back-end systems like marketing automation or CRM systems, those numbers are way off for good reason. But cool. So I guess like one of the last things to connect on is just Tag Manager, Google Tag Manager. For those that aren't familiar with it, it's obviously Google's tagging solution. And just curious your thoughts, because I think, Matt, we have a pretty mixed bag in terms of clients, using Tag Manager to kind of host or store the analytics code versus just putting it directly on the site. Because we're moving to more of an event-based world in GA4, would you recommend that clients typically use Tag Manager to install the analytics code versus directly on the site? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think honestly, GA4 or not, that's really my recommendation for all clients, is to move. Like, let's just consider this a good excuse or a good moment to deploy Tag Manager if you haven't already. It's gonna streamline your implementation process, leaps and bounds. You're gonna reduce your dependency on developers. You're gonna increase your agility to add new capabilities, new tracking, like new events as your site changes. It's just such a critical move.
It's like the category action labeled pain of having some developer on the team have to hand code or manually code an event versus being able to just do it in Tag Manager, whether it's GA3 or GA4, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think as far as GA3 versus GA4 and Tag Manager, their implementation is in some ways a little bit trickier if you have a lot of custom events. Because that category action label has gone away, you need to be a little bit more thoughtful of how do I name all these custom events, making them meaningful. And then they're called event parameters is how you kind of describe the event. So like if you have, there's a event called like generate lead, which is one of their standard events for like a lead gen site. But if you're a company that has a demo versus a trial versus a contact us, like you can pass a parameter that's, like lead gen type or form type, that would keep that information. So you just have to be a little more thoughtful instead of just stuffing everything in category action label, like you've probably been used to. You have to, again, it's a really good opportunity to come up with like a measurement strategy and a bit of an implementation process before you just start tagging things. But
I think that makes sense. So, Matt, we got through quite a bit. I mean, I think, I guess, are there any other sort of critical items within, for GA4 that I guess the audience should be aware of? Anything we didn't get to?
Let me see. I think, carrying on just our kind of the very recent topics of implementation and tag manager. Again, just take this as an opportunity to have a clean slate from a measurement perspective. I would recommend, like, don't be tempted to just copy and paste everything. You know, if you had 20 goals in GA3, maybe let's not carry all 20 over, as they call them, conversion events in GA4. Like, are they still relevant to your business? You know, many companies may have let some lapse and they're not even firing data anymore. So I would just say, take it as an opportunity to kind of reassess, start fresh, talk to your stakeholders of like, what conversion moments are important, what do I want, you know, and that sort of thing. So that would be kind of a general tip, not even necessarily GA4 specific, but just take it as a moment to rethink your implementation and make sure it meets like today's needs.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I guess one piece of advice I would have is don't freak out, because there's a lot of folks, ourselves included, trying to figure out the best way to handle the transition, the best way to handle you know, the new data that's coming in, and making sure things are being tracked properly and stored properly. You know, we're going to be looking at this closely. I know, Matt, you will be as well, over the next several months, to make sure that we're learning all the ins and outs. So I think my advice would be, like, don't freak out. You know, we're available if folks need help, or if you have another partner, they should be also heavily invested in making sure they understand all the ins and outs of GA4 and all the changes that are happening throughout the next, 12 months or so. So I think that's the main thing. Matt, really appreciate the time. Are those Warby Parker frames, by the way?
Yeah, they are.
I think I have the same frames. I should have worn them for this, because that would have been hilarious.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, that's the only reason I know, because I just got it. But they look great. So so thank you for the time. I guess before we go, Matt, if folks are interested in learning more about analytics specifically, or Tag Manager, or Data Studio, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. So again, my company is Full Sprint LLC, and probably the easiest thing is go to my website, fullsprint.net, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and be happy to have a chat and learn about what you're trying to do.
Yeah, sounds good. For any folks interested in the digital marketing side, whether it's paid search, SEO, social, feel free to hit up our website, synapsesem.com, or similarly, you can find me on LinkedIn. So thank you all. We're going to have a series of podcasts, as I mentioned at the beginning, rolling out on a monthly basis, and we will have follow-up specifically around GA4 updates. Both Matt will be putting stuff out, I'll be putting stuff out, and we might be putting some more stuff out collectively. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you all later.
All right. Bye-bye.
See you, Matt.